Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful spring Friday night. My name is Mike Halsell. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for Transatlantic Relations. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our center here at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. This evening's program is part of a lecture series during this very special year, jointly organized by the Embassy of Austria, and I'd like to welcome Ambassador Wolfgang Waldner right here in the front row, the Center for Transatlantic Relations that I represent, and other people in the audience, the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, and the Botstiber Institute for Austrian American Studies. And 2018 truly is special. It marks the 180th anniversary of U.S.-Austrian diplomatic relations, the centenary of the founding of the Republic of Austria, and the upcoming Austrian presidency of the European Union. We have already held several events in the series, one of which I was privileged to chair at the Austrian Embassy in March. And I have to say, objectively, perhaps immodestly, the reaction of participants and audience alike to these lectures so far has been uniformly positive, even enthusiastic. I don't want to intrude upon Gary Cohen's introduction of our speaker, but I have to make one small personal comment. More than 4 decades ago, Leon Botstein and I were both doctoral students in history at Harvard. The details of a few conversations that we had have faded over the years. I think I remember one about the Frankfurt School that we talked about. But I do recall thinking that this is one of the brightest guys I've ever met, and Leon's career ever since has certainly validated that judgment. I think we're in for a fascinating evening. Gary, the floor is yours.
I'm Gary Cohen from the University of Minnesota, and it's my privilege to join in welcoming you to this installment of the annual Botstiber Lecture in Washington. I speak on behalf of the Botstiber Institute for Austrian American Relations, which for the last 10 years has been working to support scholarly research, symposia, public lectures, and other projects designed to advance understanding of the historic relationship between Austria and the United States. It is part of the Dietrich W. Botstiber Foundation, founded by a wonderfully talented Austrian emigre engineer who left Austria in the 1930s, came to the US, really starting with nothing more than his education, his background, his drive, support from some American agencies that welcomed immigrants in that era. After the war, he switched engineering fields into electrical engineering, not knowing that his interest in tinkering with aeronautical instrumentation was timed exquisitely for the explosion of development in aviation, civil and military, after World War II. He left his fortune to several heirs, and particularly to this foundation, and we are the beneficiaries of it. Tonight, we are treated to hear a speaker who is a man of enormous accomplishment in many fields, and that's what I find most interesting about Leon Botstein, is the great distinction he has earned, the great renown as an educator, as a distinguished scholar and editor in the field of music history and studies in the issues of music and society, and as an engaged and by now highly distinguished conductor of symphonies and operas. Leon Botstein was born in Zurich, Switzerland in 1946, the son of Polish-Jewish emigres, both physicians. They came to the United States after some time in Switzerland. Botstein graduated, one of the many distinguished graduates of the New York High School of Music and Art. He went on to do an undergraduate history degree, I'm proud of that, at the University of Chicago, and then a PhD in history later on at the University of Chicago. Always, though, with a consuming interest in music. In his youth, he studied violin with Roman Totenberg. There was a Totenberg before Nina, for those of you in Washington who know her. And his dissertation at Harvard was really on issues of the social and economic context of music in late 19th century Vienna. He has been president of Bard College since 1975. This is a record service for any college president in the US in recent decades. Before that, he was already president of Franconia College. He's also the Leon Levy Professor in the Arts and Humanities at Bard. At Bard, he's demonstrated his commitment to far-sighted, innovative work in the liberal arts, to advancing opportunities for disadvantaged populations in secondary and higher education. His engagement in secondary education resulted in a book published in 1997, Jefferson's Children, Education, and the Promise of American Culture. In the meantime, his work in music has continued. He has been music director of the American Symphony Orchestra since 1992. His work there has been marked by innovative programming and assiduous efforts to broaden the repertoire with great success. And there are a number of recordings that he's made with the American Symphony Orchestra, with the London Symphony Orchestra, that show that commitment to opening up the repertoire, and I recommend your sampling of some of those recordings. More recently, he's been music director and principal conductor of a new initiative, the Orchestra Now, a new orchestra and graduate program in residence at Bard College. He is the co-artistic director and founder of Summerscape and the Bard Music Festival, which has an enviable record by now of, again, innovative programming focusing on a particular era, a particular composer each summer. From 2003 to 2010, he was also music director of the Jerusalem Symphony. I'm afraid to think how much time he's been spending on airplanes getting all of this done. He's published widely on subjects in music, history, culture, and education. What's distinctive about that work is his interest in showing how music has been relevant and part and parcel to social and cultural forces and circumstances over 3 centuries. He's the author of an important monograph, Judaism and Modernity, essays on the role of Jews in German and Austrian culture, published first in German in 1991, then translated into Russian and English. Since 1990, he has been editor of the distinguished journal, The Musical Quarterly. More recently, he edited Jews in the City of Vienna. There's another monograph in press, and the list of accomplishments goes on and on. We really need to hear him at this point. He'll be talking to us tonight on the political history of Eastern and Central Europe since the end of the First World War, using history as a guide, or at least as a measuring stick. His title tonight, The Cunning of History, the Politics of Today, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire of the Past. It's a pleasure to welcome Leon Botstein.
First, thank you very much. I'm not sure I would come out for this lecture on a Friday night, such a beautiful one, and so I very much appreciate your coming. I want to, and thank you for the very gracious introductions. I want to first apologize. I was very honored to be asked to do this lecture. I'll explain that in a moment. But I want to say that I'm not technically or professionally a historian of the Habsburg Empire, although I work in its musical and cultural history. And I'm not a political scientist of contemporary politics. So I'm a distinct outsider, and my opinions are therefore not grounded in a tight historical manner or a scientific manner in the sense of political science. So I want to apologize to those in the room who probably know more about the subject than I do. And so please accept my apologies. One of the reasons I accepted this is because I'm aware of the Botstiber Foundation, and the Botstiber Foundation has been historically very generous in supporting things that link culture and particularly music and history. But the most famous Botstiber is not actually the man who made the money. And so I would actually prefer to, if I accomplish nothing else, is to remind the audience of someone who is otherwise forgotten. The Botstiber who made the money was the son of a very distinguished music historian and activist in the cultural life of Vienna, Hugo Botstiber. Hugo Botstiber was originally, it's interesting because it's a Habsburg history. Botstibers are Hungarian in origin and Jewish. And Hugo Botstiber, then born in Vienna, studied two fields simultaneously. One was music, and he did his dissertation on Pachelbel and edited the first modern edition of a portion of Pachelbel's music. That's the man who wrote the canon that used to be very popular, for those of you who may not know who Pachelbel was. He also wrote a very interesting book on Beethoven, the everyday life of Beethoven, and he completed the third volume of a classic biography of Franz Joseph Haydn. He became the assistant to Eusebius Mandichevsky, who was the great friend of Brahms and the librarian archivist of the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde. For those of you who know something about Vienna, to understand that the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, which was founded during the Napoleonic period, was a merger of aristocrats and so-called second society in Vienna to continue a cultural life that was economically no longer possible the way the Esterházys did it. It was a combination of patronage, privately organized, that sponsored concerts. It's they who founded the first chorus of Vienna, the Singverein, and also the conservatory. And they lived in some quarters until 1870 with a lottery and the support of the emperor. They built, with Theophil von Hansen as the architect, the Musikverein, which has become now the most famous and well-known concert hall probably in the world. The conservatory was housed there, also the Wiener Männergesangverein, which was a very important institution in 19th century Vienna. But it was it had a limited seating capacity. And as the city of Vienna grew in the late 19th century, there was no access to concerts. We don't quite realize this, that the significance of music in the city of Vienna was not the result of having access to concerts at all. Every seat in that house was actually a subscription that was passed down from family to family. And there's a great, and generally audiences in Vienna were a closed circle of a very limited elite. And for obvious reasons, Botstiber is exactly the same generation of Arnold Schoenberg, and a young group of people decided this wasn't right, and there was an effort to expand the concert life. And they founded a concert society, and in the 1890s, Botstiber, really 1992, Botstiber became the first organizer and founder of what later became the Wiener Konzerthausgesellschaft. This was the organization that organized a brilliant idea of building a more popular, a more contemporary, anti-elite concert venue. In fact, they had two things they wanted to combine in this concert venue. When you look at the original architectural plans, one was an ice skating rink, which actually got built because they ran out of money much later, and they sold the land for this ice skating rink, and some kind of bicycle. I have never figured this one out, kind of bicycle club, which is going to be in this concert hall. And they had this idea of an open air venue that would seat as many as 40,000 people. I never quite understood. There was a kind of very, very visionary architect named Baumann, whose idea this was. Finally, in 1913, in the presence of the Kaiser, they opened up on the eve of the First World War the Konzerthaus as we know it now, which was built by Fellner, one of the great concert hall architects of the period. And actually, for that, they did the Ninth Symphony and a new piece by Richard Strauss. They wanted to show they were about contemporary music piece, which is called the Festival Prelude, a real barn burner. And so this thing opened, and it had a completely, to this day, has a somewhat different programming cast than the Musikverein and the Gesellschaft. And the guiding light of this was Hugo Botstiber. And he had studied with Zemlinsky. He was himself very well trained. There is a performance in 1931, the first performance in Vienna of the poem of Fire by Scriabin, which requires a so-called light piano, a kind of a synesthesia instrument, and Botstiber actually played in that performance himself. And he was the first secretary of the Gesellschaft, of the Wiener Konzerthaus Gesellschaft, from 1910, before the thing was built, till 1937. So he was the guiding spirit of this very major and interesting institution. This is the place where Karl Kraus did his famous public readings of Offenbach. And this is where really much of Schoenberg, modern French music in the 20s, it was a truly innovative program. He also, really wanted music to be connected, so he did popular things, which brought him under a lot of criticism. He was the first to organize radio transmissions of concerts from a concert hall. So he was a visionary person. What's interesting about the Wiener Konzerthaus Gesellschaft is that it was also an explicitly German national institution. Inscribed was a quote from Wagner's Die Meistersinger about the honoring of German art. And so he was himself, let's call him an Austro-nationalist. He was an incredibly passionate patriot, and he engaged in many programs to popularize the Austrian cultural heritage in the 20s, at the same time as he brought the first major jazz concerts into Vienna. Accepting a Botstiber lecture was, for me, as they say in the vernacular, no-brainer. And if I accomplish anything, it is to recall the great achievement. And of course, he fled with the family in the Anschluss. He died in England in 1942, and the family moved on to America. He was, and remained until recently, a new biography has just come out, an unknown figure, a forgotten figure. My presence here is justified by two things in the present, and that is that within the former boundaries of the Habsburg monarchy, or after 1867, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, I am the artistic director of the Grafenegg Campus and Academy. This is second largest festival in Austria, and my boss gives me legitimacy in Austrian history, is Tassilo Metternich. And it gives me some sense of irony in this role. And my first season is this year, and we open at the end of June with programs that are organized around the end of the monarchy and the interwar period. And the second is that I'm chairman of the board of the Central European University in Budapest, which is in the midst of a, what can only be described, a serious struggle with the government of Hungary and the Fidesz party, which now dominates the new Hungarian parliament. My perspective is, for this talk, is both on the past and the present. So let's turn for the moment to the past. So those of us who trained in European history in the late 20th century accepted without much criticism the notion that the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was a dysfunctional, collapsing, crumbling enterprise. And pick up any book about any Viennese figure, whether it be Klimt in painting or Otto Wagner, despite the tremendous brilliance of Otto Wagner's transformation of the city, particularly in English-speaking literature, it's all talked about in retrospect. With the dissolution of the monarchy, it's kind of a history in retrospect. A very great teacher once said that the most reliable instrument for all knowledge is the retrospectoscope. And there is a great deal of truth. Jewish history is often, European Jewish history is often written from the perspective of the Holocaust, backwards, as if there's a kind of teleology that leads to it. In the case of the Habsburg monarchy, it also had the misfortune of the symbolic presence of Kaiser Franz Joseph, who the old man of Europe, who seemed to be witless in particularly matters of foreign affairs, and a kind of symbol whose hold on this multinational empire was crumbling. Now, owing to the work of a new generation of historians, and I particularly want to point out Peter Judson's book, which recent book, has pursued the line of argument which seems to be directly on point. Particularly on point because it is important for the present situation. It turns out that there was nothing inevitable about the dissolution of the monarchy. Despite the growth of nationalist movements, and I'll go through three of them very briefly through the perspective of music, the fact is that the monarchy, both economically and administratively, was hardly as inept and as incompetent, and actually struggled with some success in negotiating the tension between Germanic centrics in Joseph II, administration in Vienna, with a subsidiary administration in Budapest, and the polylingual character, which also influenced the army. And that there was more success than failure in the actual performance. If you take away the catastrophe of the assassination in Sarajevo and the onset of World War I. And in retrospect, and here I echo a heartbreaking book written by Franz Werfel, a Prague Jew, in 1937, where he, among others, talk very glowingly in a nostalgic way about life under the Habsburg Empire. And what did they mean? A life in which people of difference, with different languages, different religions, actually got along in the face of clear prejudice. So it was not only the question of anti-Semitism, which was, of course, a major issue, but also snobbishness from Germans to Slavs, tensions between and among the Slavs who were resident in Vienna. Take the city of Vienna. The city of Vienna when the Blue Danube was written, which became a marker. It was written for the Männergesangverein. Its original version has a chorus in it, which you never hear. But this was a piece of invention. Old Vienna, that's the Vienna before the Ringstrasse, fewer than 20% of the population of late 19th century Vienna was born in Vienna. It was a city of immigrants from within the empire. But they molded a myth of a common heritage, and they all adopted in an assimilationist and acculturating way, just as Hugo Botstiber did, a kind of shared culture that had within it an acknowledgement of tensions. There was no Jew in Vienna, despite the fact they were 12 to 13% of the population, who didn't realize that everybody knew that they were Jewish. They didn't expect to be totally accepted as kind of ethnically German Austrian. But they had no difficulty walking around in Trachten and dirndls, as photographs of the Freud family will show. It didn't bother them. They didn't think they were appropriating someone else's culture, and no one thought they looked foolish in it. And those Trachten dirndls are themselves 19th century inventions. So there was a kind of a conspiracy of this diverse group to create the image of a common culture. And what the revisionist view of the history of the Habsburg Empire suggests is that in it was, as Werfel suggested, and the survivors suggested, and which is why Josef Roth was always, the writer always said that the Jew in the Habsburg Empire was the most loyal citizen of the empire. And in the Radetzky March, there's a great scene in which, on a Sunday, the emperor is reviewing on the eastern front of the empire a military. He's looking at his troops, and he's on his horse in front of his adjutants, and they're riding along, and there's a group of Jews at the end of dressed out in their finest, holding Torah scrolls. It's the representatives of the Jewish community of the nearby city, and they're coming to greet and honor the emperor. And the emperor gets off his horse. The adjutants are behind him in Roth's telling of this, and there's a conversation, and they hand him some kind of symbol and present, and he hands it to one of his aides. He gets back on the horse, and they ride back. And as they're riding back, one of his chief adjutants rides close to him and says, "Funny people, those Jews. Can't understand a word they say." To which the emperor is said to reply, "They weren't talking to you." So what is Roth trying to say? Roth is trying to say that the loyalty was to a dynasty, that the political framework in which the empire thrived was a dynasty which was not competitive with national identity. That's the suggestion that comes from the revisionism. For example, let's take the Czechs to start with. It would have been terrific if they had figured out a triple monarchy as opposed to a double monarchy. But the Czech party had varying elements in it. There were the radicals. So you take the three most famous Czech composers. They each represent kind of moving extremity in Czech national identity. The most German-friendly was Dvořák, who was clearly a Czech nationalist, but felt no difficulty in being bilingual in German. He was actually a little bit more comfortable, in Czech, but he was, his publisher was a German publisher. His editor was Brahms himself. Brahms didn't try, he was too sloppy, so Brahms offered to copy edit his material before it was in publication, with great honor. Brahms was not a generous man, as when it comes to other composers. Smetana was oddly really never mastered Czech at all, but he was more radical in his political attitude to the autonomy of the Czech. And there's Janáček, whose entire musical vocabulary is based on the speech melody of Czech language and was a real adherent of Panslavism. And the Symphonietta is itself a paean to the independence of the Czech nation. He was a radical nationalist. Poland. Poland, the truth is that the backbone of Polish nationalism derived from Russian Poland. The real motivation for an independent Poland came from the experience with the Tsarist regime. First in 1830, and most significantly in 1863, Joseph Conrad's father was a victim and was exiled in that revolt, and it is they who drove the idea of recreating a modern Poland. They had strong allies in Prussian Poland, because the Prussians were not as harsh as the Russians, but they did believe in Germanization. So they, in Poznan and places like that, they tried to prevent the Polish language from being a language of instruction in the schools. But in Galicia, the story is quite different. The Czartoryskis, for example, major noble family from Poland, were very active in the founding of the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde. There was a whole aristocratic nationalism, I would call, that had no difficulty in somehow reconciling the assertion of Polishness with kind of autonomy within a dynastic framework. This is an aristocratic conceit, and it's very different from a populist nationalism. The Hungarian case is not dissimilar. So in preparation for this lecture, I have to confess that I did something I've always resisted in doing, and that is watching the Sissi, the three. I've always avoided this, but I finally broke down and watched all of them. And I was riveted. It was totally riveting, frankly. And one doesn't have to critique them. I think they had a real difficulty in shooting in Vienna because there are buildings there that didn't exist. I mean, this is a problematic issue for those of you who know the history of the city of Vienna. But there too, so you have this Hungarian nationalist group in the aristocracy and the gentry, Andrássy, a good example, where it's reconcilable in some way with a dynastic monarchical system. And then that deteriorates later in the turn of the century in the generation of Bartók and Kodály, who become very forceful. So the three great Hungarian composers, doesn't chronologically quite work out. So when Bartók's mother went to see Dochnányi's mother, because they both came from Pozsony, from Bratislava, to ask where should her talented son go to the conservatory. Dochnányi had gone to Vienna, and his first music got a lot of approval from Brahms, which sort of gave spur to his career as a pianist and as a composer. He was a patriot, and he got himself in trouble with Szálasi later. This is a different matter. But the mother was equivocal, but Dochnányi's mother. But Bartók's mother had the insight that actually the less famous and the less established conservatory, the Liszt Academy in Budapest, was the right place for her son to go. And he came there with a tremendous impetus and was for a kind of Hungarian nationalism. And he and Kodály then reinvented the idea of Hungarian music, which was a conceit. They really were trying to attack what they thought Roma gypsy-related urban folk music as being authentically Hungarian, and look to a countryside that was essentially under siege from industrialization, where there was a kind of dying, original, authentic music. Whether that's original, authentic, I don't know. A very, very bright, smart colleague of mine once suggested that all the microtonality, for example, that was documented in these recordings using technology weren't intentional. The people couldn't play in tune. So that's why there was nothing really intentional, which is a great, and I like these kinds of counterfactual hypotheses. In any event, what I'm suggesting, I mean, and again, if you look at the Balkans, it's a more problematic situation, that if you take away the myth that starts with Meyerling and the suicide of the Archduke Rudolf, and you take away all of what we have habitually understood to be the kind of culture that emerges from a disintegrating society, and we link Peter Altenberg's pedophilism with somehow the dissolution of a political system. Take that away and say, is that a necessary argument? I would agree that it's not, that actually this was a thriving, very plausible administrative political alternative. From our current point of view, it pays for us to look at that because of the problems the European Union now has, and to think, is this completely fanciful? So, the first point I would make is that nationalism, in its modern form, becomes reductive, especially if it is combined with religion and language, and it becomes a political unit to which entrance is impossible. There's no way you can become authentically Hungarian. When Viktor Orban made his speech before the election on the anniversary of the Revolution of 1848, his point was, we need to preserve a Christian Hungarian nation. Now, he's completely, knowingly, because a clever man, has obliterated all the real micro differences in Hungarian. There isn't one Hungarian. He's reductively created a unit. And that unit, and we have the same issue in the United States. It has to do with color, being white, a certain kind of white, and there's kind of what we call a nativist populist notion of the unit that is the legitimate heir. It's very, unfortunately, similar to Blut and Boden kind of arguments. They have a long history, but they've really taken root in modern contemporary politics. What's problematic, especially since the issue that got Orban elected, is migration. The interesting thing is that in the dynastic context, the most significant minority within the Habsburg Empire that was shared by all of its regions, the Jews, managed to assimilate by acculturating themselves without sacrifice to their religious habits and commitments. If you go into the only remaining synagogue in Vienna from the Kornhäuser building, the Stadttempel, you will see the plaques to Solomon Sulzer, who was the cantor for whom Franz Schubert wrote, for the opening of the synagogue, a Hebrew setting a cappella to match what we call the Viennese rite, which he wrote, which is a solo voice and four male accompanied four-part harmony. He was a teacher at the conservatory as well. The most famous theorist who knew Hugo Botstiber very well was Heinrich Schenker, most famous theorist of Viennese turn of the century, who died in the 1930s. He was an active member of the Kultusgemeinde. He kept his house as a kosher home, and he was an observant religious Jew and the greatest authority in Vienna on Beethoven and on Viennese classicism. So there was, as in the case of Dvořák, a way to reconcile difference with political citizenship. One can make a parallel with this monarchical dynastic framework to, let's say, the American claims, which are now unfortunately threatened by current political views, in which citizenship can be acquired and equality attained through a political mechanism in the structure of democracy. Canada as well. So it seems to me that the privileging of nationalism, take Poland is another example. Poland is a more difficult case because, unlike Hungary, it's single religion. Hungary at least has a Calvinist minority. The Polish case is very extreme because the claim to homogeneity is so powerful. So the question that I would raise is when we study the Habsburg Empire and we take away, thanks to the work of recent historians, the notion that there was a crumbling, disintegrating mechanism, what can we learn? Now, the Sissi films, going back to the Sissi films, is that what's interesting about that is they were done in the 50s. And what is immensely interesting is that in the post-World War II period, there is a persistent, what I would call monarchical nostalgia. It never takes traction. It never takes hold. I thought it would be a great thing, you know, if they would use all the buildings in Vienna, recreate the monarchy in an English way. Imagine the tourist business. When they buried Zita, for example, it was a great public event, you know, and there's something to the idea of finding a way to construct an alliance of different kinds of national units, because the attraction of the majority of Hungarians, or the people who have voted, for example, in the far right, in the Austrian case, and the backing behind the ruling party of Poland, and the success of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin essentially reinvented the pillars that Uvarov, the secretary of the advisor to Nicholas I, autocracy, nationalism, and orthodoxy. He's figured that out. He's returned to a very simple formula. Why does it work? It works because people find the cosmopolitan claim as lacking in community, lacking in some sense of togetherness in some political way, that it is highly individualistic, that, as the argument was always made, that the two extremes, and when the Zemstvo, for example, movement after the emancipation of serfs got going, there was this talk about the Russian tradition being distinct as a communal tradition, whereas the American was a materialist, individualist tradition. And there's no doubt that the motivation of people is a sense of preserving their culture, their continuity, their sense of community. Can you actually generate that kind of sensibility without sacrificing some allegiance to differences? And can you do that in a way that allows people to enter, to assimilate? To return to the issue of migration. Is it possible to create a political system where the idea of some equality, not total equality, political equality, and some sacrifice to a kind of regressive tradition, the modernization of certain kinds of habits of life, so one has multiple identities in a multiple national, communal, political framework. And I think that is something that people smarter than I am and with more experience in politics need to figure out, because the cosmopolitan, as it has been attacked in the figure of George Soros, for example, of a rootless, ambitious, greedy individual that has no regard for community and for heritage, and is only interested in his self-interest, and is rootless. This is a classic trope. This is familiar to all of us. Is actually not the case. Why did Mr. Soros found a foundation in Hungary in the 80s? Because he is a true Hungarian patriot. The nationalist narrative can't be owned only by Viktor Orban. George Soros is the most generous philanthropist to the citizens of Hungary in its entire history. He ranks with Széchenyi. He ranks right up there. He has an emotional, historical connection to a people whom he feels part of, despite the fact that he was expelled, in essence, under the Hungarian fascists, and his parents then after 56. The same is true in their Polish examples. My own teacher, Roman Totenberg, Arthur Rubinstein, remained deeply attached to Polish culture, the Polish nation, despite the unmistakable presence of anti-Semitism and of hostility. So the narrative of patriotism and community cannot be owned only by the extreme right, by the most reductive, exclusive notion. And the cosmopolitan can't be portrayed, in my view, only as being individualistic and disassembling, so to speak, of the notion of community. And I now turn to the last point I want to make. So, from my perspective, as we face the Central European University, which is a university in Budapest with students from 120 nations, a graduate university, brilliantly led by its rector-president, Michael Ignatieff, who is himself a descendant of Russian aristocracy to Canada after the Revolution, and is a Canadian, and was a distinguished Canadian politician as well. The question is, Viktor Orban has made it quite clear that the university is not viewed by him as fitting in, as kind of subversive to his definition of the mandate and the community that got him elected. So, as is known in the press, there are discussions of setting up a campus in Vienna, and depending on what the political situation finally plays out, it'll either be a branch campus or it'll be the entire university. And in having to sort of oversee this process of negotiation and meeting with the mayor of Vienna, Heupel, and members of the Austrian government, and I'm pleased to say that this memorandum of agreement to create a campus in Vienna has gotten the support of the chancellor, and not of the FAR of the FPÖ, but of the centrist party. And you realize that, return to the Botstiber Foundation, that Austria, that struggled after 1918 with defining its own identity, Austrian identity, against a pan-German movement that had a long history of arguing for an Anschluss long before the Nazis realized it, that there is something that is reminiscent of the motivation behind Hugo von Hofmannsthal and Max Reinhardt's founding of the Salzburg Festival, which they believed Salzburg to be the center of Europe, and they believed it to be a place that Austria could come forward as a kind of non-nationalistic, non-essentialist place that was hospitable to difference. And that the question is that when we look at the two places, there's no question that one has a greater sense of optimism about Vienna than one does about Budapest in the short and long term. It is ironic, you know, when the book by Hugo Bettauer, Die Stadt ohne Juden, was published. He was killed. And when you read that book, it's a book of science fiction because it describes the Vienna of post-1945 brilliantly. The situation in Budapest is more severe, although there's a large Jewish community there now, comparatively to any other city. You know, in turn of the century, 25% of Budapest was Jewish. Therefore, it was nicknamed Judapest. But the loss of that minority, the extermination of that minority, has allowed a vacuum to be filled by this form of nationalism, which ultimately is corrosive. And in order to fight it in the hearts and minds of the citizenry, one has to find a way to reconcile the political membership and loyalty to a community with the tolerance of difference. This was, in a way, they were right. The emigres were in that sense right. This was the magic of the Habsburg Empire. by an overlay of dynastic loyalty and local difference. And in smaller units, it still exists to some extent in Switzerland. So I want to say that one would have thought the study of the Habsburg Empire to be a dead-end subject for historians, and I'm pleased to say that we're in a moment of renewal of this subject, and that its relevance to the political present precisely in the area of the former empire. So, of course, if I could wake up from a dream, it might be good for these nations to reassemble, perhaps not with a monarch. That's a slightly expensive proposition, but maybe there's some unit that's different from the European Union, that is different from the current model, which seems to have run into so much difficulty in preservation of the seemingly irreconcilable notions of individuality, freedom, liberty, and egalitarian political membership, and distinction of community, tradition, and history, into something that people from an entirely different part of the world could find a trustworthy way to assimilate. Final word I would say is that when someone says, well, why is it so difficult for the Islamic migration to find a way into European culture? There are many explanations. But one odd explanation is that if I were a member of that community and I read my history, I would think that assimilation was a bad route. Because actually, political anti-Semitism in Central Europe and in the Habsburg monarchy rose in intensity correlative with assimilation. When the Jews were confined to a ghetto, you could identify them on the street. They looked different, they spoke differently, they ate differently. They weren't dangerous. But when they began to look like us, they were described as a hidden poison. That was the brilliance of Richard Wagner's essay on Judaism and music, that they were a kind of hidden, disintegrating force that was invisible. That assimilation and political anti-Semitism have a correlative history. So if I were a young Muslim coming from Syria, and I entered a European capital and a European nation, and I would think, well, who are the last people who tried to mixture identity and continuity with assimilation? What happened to them? The story is not encouraging. I think the time has come to think of a way to try to create a pathway or a story with more, if one can say, of a happy end. Thank you.
Stanley Kober. If not assimilation, then what? If not assimilation, you ended saying the problem was assimilation. What is the American motto? E pluribus unum. It's assimilation. The alternative is what? Permanent division?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question. You were saying if not assimilation. Well, let's talk what assimilation means. So assimilation, in my mind, I mean, it's not a precise term. And there are two related terms that you know. One would be acculturation, the other is assimilation. So assimilation is a continuum. And what I mean by assimilation would be what I would call a minimum assimilation. That a minimum assimilation would be someone who actually participates in the public life of a community, but conducts a large measure of their lives according to rules and habits which are not maybe shared by a sub-community. So assimilation would require a compromise with a radical construct of loyalty to inherited tradition. So I can only speak intelligently about in the Jewish community. So what you see today as modern, or in my view, modern Orthodoxy, and certainly in Hasidism, is a radical reinvention of tradition. It's not actually a restoration movement, it's a very vital, innovative movement. Even the way in which halakha is interpreted in terms of modern events. I mean, what is finally going to be the proper use on a Sabbath of a self-driving car? Now, the way in which the tradition of rabbinical commentary, if you take it back, would be more flexible than what you'll see coming out now, in my view. If you read Moses Mendelssohn carefully, I think he found a way to reconcile what I would call participation in an intellectual world, a universal world, with his particularism. He's a great example in my mind of a man who bridged two worlds very effectively without sacrifice to his identity as a Jew or his work as a scholar of Judaism. So the fact that his son converted the children is not a result of the father. They actually waited till the grandmother died. Leah, his wife, mother died. Abraham Mendelssohn's mother. So that's, in the United States case, the situation is made much more easy. Having grown up I can only speak anecdotally, in an emigre community, that the Americans managed, this is the miracle of the country in the best sense, to make all these people who barely spoke the language well feel as if they were equal citizens. And they lived in enclaves, real enclaves, very distinct enclaves in the old city of New York. I recently had an event in the old Bohemian Association on 73rd Street. I don't know if you've ever seen that building. The Czech government now owns it. Fantastic place. It was built in the 90s to preserve Bohemian Moravian culture, a fantastic place. And so the people who did that and lived in that neighborhood figured that out in some way. Now, it was unstable, and that has to do with a lot of other historical factors, but it could be, I mean, the Amish have continued this for an endless period of time, reinvented themselves successfully. So that's what, in my own estimation, in order to be a legitimate American, I don't have to be exactly like the person in Kansas. And the uniformity of national identity is itself an invention. Let me give you an example that's completely not European. So Mexico, the Mexican Revolution of 1910. Mexico before 1910 is defined by tremendous differences which still exist in Mexico in regions. Fantastic differences. But Jose Vasconcelos, who was the first Minister of Education under Obregón, that's why they commissioned Diego Rivera and Siqueiros and Orozco and created public art. They invested in Carlos Chavez and Revueltas. They wanted to create a modern Mexican identity that would define the entire nation, would cover over the regional differences and could be absorbed successfully. And to some extent, they've been very successful at it. Not completely, but quite successful at it.
Super talk. You didn't disappoint. Just a brief comment and then a question. You asked rhetorically whether there would be a subgrouping within the European Union that might serve as a vehicle for, and I have to say what comes to mind is not very promising. I'm thinking about Visegrad, where all four governments, each one is worse than the next. The question I would have is actually the first stage is alinguistication, and then some kind of acculturation, and then some kind of assimilation. Your Syrian immigrant will there are certain responsibilities that the national governments within the EU place upon citizens. There's a liberal democratic ideology, and we have to be honest. I mean, I'm all for immigration, I'm all for helping refugees, but there are responsibilities on both sides. My question is, what was, getting back to the Jewish position in the Habsburg Empire, was there the same sort of legal standards that the Jewish community, with all its particularism, had to abide by in order to be loyal subjects of the empire? And is that a parallel with, let's say, what a Muslim immigrant from some other country coming into Europe would have to do with regard to treatment of women, with regard to tolerance for other religions and the whole?
It's a very good question. So the legal status of the Jews changes after the Ausgleich very dramatically. And as you know, suffrage doesn't come, it comes much later. It's a much later phenomenon. So they, in a way, benefit from the restriction of political access. Political participation is restricted altogether, so they're in a large group of people that's largely economic in its character. The Jews run into trouble in Vienna, and particularly having to do with the change in industrial. So take a very small area, clothes making, right? The Jews were in the forefront of the ready-made clothes. And they ran into tremendous trouble with the local guilds of dressmakers and tailors. So there are economic issues which we don't have time to go into that affect it. My instinct is that, let's say the Visegrad thing, what has clearly failed is integration. Everybody said this, so I'm not saying anybody, from the top down. It doesn't emotionally. There are no Europeans. Who are the Europeans? The only Europeans I've ever met are actually musicians. Because nobody cares who you are, where you come from, and you can play, please play. There's a little of so if you're a Russian, they want you to play Russian music. If I get invited, the first thing they ask me to do is play American music. Nobody will buy a CD by an Austrian playing Duke Ellington. I don't know why, but I wish they would. You know what I mean? I'm pleased to see that the most exciting klezmer bands are populated by non-Jews, and they're crossover events. That's great, So I am very allergic to kind of cultural essentialism or appropriation. Appropriation is a great thing, actually, because it's partly inventing, giving something life. So the question is, how do you reconcile? So we have a campus in Berlin. Bard happens to have a campus in Berlin. We have we have a large program. We have a lot of Syrian refugees. It's a very small campus. We have actually more Syrian refugees than Humboldt or Freie Universität have. And we have only 260 students. So it's kind of St. John's great books kind of curriculum. And this is a question which is discussed. There is definitely a compromise. If you don't mind if I know this is being videotaped, an off-color joke. Humor is now politically incorrect, but I'm going to risk it if everybody, I want to put my apologies ahead of time. So on the question of assimilation, there's a very great story on the massive emigration from Eastern Europe to the United States. There is the apocryphal story of a Jewish man who comes to America, and he's very religious, comes from a religious home, and so forth and so on. And he's 5-10 years in America, and he does very well, and he comes home to see his mother. And he walks in, and the mother looks at him, and he says, "Where's your beard?" He said, "Look, Mama, in America, a long beard, I have to do business with people, can't have a beard." He says, "Do you keep the Sabbath?" He said, "I can't. It's a Christian country, the business on the Sabbath, I have to work on the Sabbath." And she says, "Do you keep a kosher home?" He said, "I might have to eat with clients, how can you keep kosher?" He said, "Are you still circumcised?" So the question is, there is no doubt that that was the point of the Haskalah movement. The idea that one finds a way. So Schenker found a way, Sulzer found a way. Hanslick, who had a Jewish parent but was brought up Catholic, has a great review. He goes to the Stadttempel at one of the anniversaries and hears Sulzer things, and he writes this review of this fantastic thing. And so there was a way. You didn't have to assimilate completely and convert. The route, let's say, that Kraus or Schoenberg started and then abruptly. That's why we used to joke that the only Protestants in Vienna were Jews, because that was a kind of compromise. It didn't look so bad. To become a Catholic the way Kraus did was simply unacceptable. And the way we think about identity is so reductive now, and that's the conversation we have to change. We have used historical research to show that what it means to be Scottish has nothing to do with what it was really like to be Scottish in the 17th century, and in fact, all those kilts are 19th century inventions. It's completely, we have allowed modern political nationalism of the late 19th century, early 20th to dominate the conversation, to be authentically Austrian. You can hear it still when someone from Carinthia speaks and someone from Tyrol speaks. The great advantage of the Swiss is that you can hear every canton, in the language. We have to break up that idea, and once you break it up, room will be created for the Syrians to create a German Syrian. We've done it. The Italian American, Irish American. There's nothing German about an Oktoberfest in Pennsylvania, trust me, right? When we came to America, my parents were flabbergasted. They had their Abitur in Polish, and they bought an American published Polish dictionary. And I remember my parents were on the floor, tears in their eyes of laughter at the butchery of the Polish language was being propagated in cities like Buffalo and Detroit and Chicago. Completely had no connection whatsoever for what they recognize as their language. But their snobbishness, right, overlooked a very fine point, which is these were real Americans, Polish Americans. And we go to Chicago still, there are churches where the sermons are in Polish, and they cater to a Polish community, and they're Rostenkowski, who was head of Ways and Means, that was a serious guy. He was a Polish American and was damn proud of it. It's possible to do. Look at the Kennedys. There's not much Irish about them. There's American Irish about them. That's a separate identity. The same with Italian food that came out of America is completely different from what you have in Florence. There was no Italy. The idea that there's an Italy in the 19th century is a total myth. Nobody in the South could understand the North, and they didn't want anything to do with each other. There was no Italian language. The choice of Florence and Dante is kind of emblematic of what is Italian, is an invention, the way Napoleon did it in France. So I'm just suggesting that if we can find a way to break open what we consider the label that I'm an Austrian, I'm a Hungarian, a Jew. I love anti-Semites because, like all prejudiced people, they reduce who you are to an unbelievable simplification. The old joke, in Poland, with a large Polish Jewish population during the war, I think there were 28 separate Jewish parties. No one agreed with anyone else, and everybody had a different construct of what it meant to be who they were. What unified them were the anti-Semites. That's the only thing that unified them.
Well, so with that nationalism as a construct in mind, going back to the era of the Habsburgs, I'd like to hear your comments, any insights on what were really the effects that were still pervasive today when, thanks to treaties after World War I, and then how Germany, how they were treated under those treaties, reparations such, the dynamics that were formed. and especially the breakup of the original empire, how did that really affect these conceptions of these nationalisms?
If I understood the question right, it's a very good question because my story is highly simplified. And the simplification is that with the abolition of aristocracy, although there is still in German-speaking Europe some kind of tacit recognition of class structure, in England certainly the case as well. But with the abolition of a certain kind of class hierarchy, again, a vacuum was created. I'm not arguing for any restoration of aristocratic privilege. You know, it's nice to be with someone and get a table in a restaurant when it's full. I mean, but even I recognize that that's probably not a good thing, you know, and one has a sense of humor about it. But so what happened in the First World War was, it was an unbelievable radical moment. And the radical moment had so many variables at stake. And those variables created a vacuum in which an unbelievable redefinition took place. The Austrians had a more difficult problem because they really had to think it through. So the 20s are a very difficult time in trying to figure out what being Austrian is. But it's interesting. I think there's an analogy between, let's say, the phenomenon in the internet now of segmented patterns of news and discussion, let's say even Fox News, in the success of papers like the Völkische Beobachter or Der Stürmer. You know, that in the 20s, the Nazis understood very brilliantly that if you put stuff out that looked like a newspaper, looked like the real thing with, you know, a byline and, you know, arguments that were pseudoscientific, people would believe it, and that they would get a readership that then thought the Frankfurter Zeitung was fake news. You know, you couldn't tell them the truth because it's all made up. It's a conspiracy. So the ability in a very dislocated period to sell conspiracy theories which are never disprovable, completely not disprovable. So it's fascinating that the World War I is a catastrophe in many ways. One, it is just the bloodbath without a redeeming reason. And the corruption and irresponsibility of the monarchical and aristocratic classes can't be underestimated. But it did create a vacuum which is very hard to fill. And it got filled by this kind of reductive identity definitions, which are the backbone of movements. Even, you know, that's the tragedy. Bela Bartok, I'll close with Bartok. So, when he and Kodai went out to document real Hungarian music, and they discovered a complexity, rhythmic and tonal complexity, which gave him a vocabulary as a composer, a fantastic vocabulary as a composer. In the 30s, he was finally recognized by the right and won for early work, not the work that he really thought was his modern work. And he quickly realized that his research in folk music was being appropriated by the far right. And that motivated him to leave. He was a real Hungarian patriot. And he went on a trip to Turkey in the 30s, and with Saygun, a Turkish composer, did research. He had done this in North Africa, and he developed a theory, which the Hungarians never liked, that all folk music is related and actually derives from North Africa, which of course explodes. And of course he enraged everybody because he published a book on Slovakian folk music, and basically, and they said, well, and showed that the differences between Slovakian and Hungarian are marginal, and the Romanian as well. So, you know, he was not on the same. He didn't want to be appropriated, and that's what drove him to emigrate and to become active in New York and the anti-fascist movement. That's the kind of patriotism that needs to be nurtured. It wasn't that he felt uprooted. He felt Hungarian. He was nothing but Hungarian. But he realized that what he had done, which was to reinvigorate a sense of the Hungarianness, backfired. It became fodder for a movement to which he had no sympathy whatsoever. And that's the kind of impetus that we could use. And a beneficiary of a Soros scholarship to Oxford.